Hi and welcome to Jane Eyre week. All the videos that I'll be posting this week, as you might have guessed, will be Jane Eyre themed. This book is loved by so many people that I just kind of wanted to devote an entire week to it. Maybe it's a good chance for you to reread it, or if you haven't read it yet, maybe this is a good time to start. This is my copy of Jane Eyre. It's kind of a weird penguin edition, but I love this mass paperback size. I read this book when I was at university. I wrote an essay on it, but I don't really remember a lot, and I can't remember if I read the entire thing. But I have seen the adaptations so many times, so I'm quite familiar with the story. I feel like when you review a classic novel, people sometimes expect you to sort of really break it down and talk about the historical background and almost kind of teach it as a sort of lesson on the book, but what I really want to do is just talk about my personal experience of reading Jane Eyre. But if you want a more detailed breakdown, I'd suggest you check out the Jane Eyre episodes from Crash Course Literature. Jane Eyre is about a young girl called Jane Eyre, and when she was younger, her aunt was sort of forced to take her in because she was an orphan, and then she sent her off to this school for girls called Lowood. It's strict, it's cold, the girls don't get a lot of food, and in general they sort of have a miserable time there. But Jane sort of manages to make the best of the situation. She's always very rebellious, but obviously at the school she has to tone that down and learn how to be quiet. She gets a good education and eventually becomes a teacher there, and when she's 18 she decides that she wants to advertise as a governess so she can see a little bit more of the world. So she ends up at Thornfield Hall, where she is the governess to a young French girl called Adele, and she lives there with the caretaker of the house, Mrs. Fairfax. And then one day when she's out to bring a letter to a nearby town, she runs into someone, or he sort of runs into her because he's on a horse. Horse stumbles, he falls off his horse. She helps this mysterious stranger back on his horse while he accuses her of being a witch. They both go on their merry way, but when she comes back to Thornfield Hall, she realizes that that was Mr. Rochester, the man who owns Thornfield Hall. He seems a bit grumpy and a bit rude, but as they spend time together, turns out they get along quite well. But meanwhile, there are also some mysterious things happening in Thornfield Hall. Kind of want to stop here because I don't want to give too much away, but there's a lot more going on. Because it's quite a big book. My edition has about 600 pages. First of all, Charlotte Brontë published this book under the pseudonym Currer Bell, which is either a male pseudonym or a neutral pseudonym. What I found quite interesting and that there are lots of instances of Jane talking about how she wishes that women could do the same things that men do. Just go out and just have an exciting life and not be stuck at home. And it's quite interesting to think about how people at the time would have perceived this if they had known it was written by a woman or if they thought it was written by a man. I found Jane a very pleasant character. She's very smart. She really likes to observe people and figure out their personalities. She seems very stable, but from a younger age she sort of has this rage inside and she wants to burst free. The setting is really remote. Thornfield Hall is very quiet and empty most of the times, and it makes it a really good setting for creepy stuff to happen. But Jane Eyre's life in general is quite lonely and limited. She used to live with her aunt, and then she went to Lowood, and then she went to Thornfield Hall, and like she says, she has never really seen a lot of the world before, although she does fantasize about it. And then to contrast that, there is Mr. Rochester, who's been all across the world, and he has all these amazing stories about faraway countries. One of my favorite bits is when Jane is talking about how she's never really seen a hot guy before, but she bets that if she would ever see one, she would know. Gives you a good idea of like how limited her contact with the outside world has been, which is also something that comes up in the book quite a lot, where she talks about the theme of like, if you haven't experienced a lot, or if you're quite plain, or if you're younger, does it make you less than anyone else? Especially with the treatment of children at Lowood, where they're just kind of like, kids don't really have feelings, so it's okay, they just need to learn how to behave and be quiet. And I feel like a lot of the book is Jane sort of fighting for her little place in the world. I also like that when she first meets Mr. Rochester and he's being kind of rude, her first reaction is, that's very exciting, because imagine if he would have been very polite, that would have been quite boring. At least this way, it's bringing some excitement to my life. Because the little girl Adele is French and Mr. Rochester speaks French and Jane speaks French, there is quite a bit of French in this book, and there were sometimes just entire paragraphs in French. And if you don't speak French, you can just skip it and you'll be fine. You might miss a couple of phrases, but you'll get the general gist of what's going on. It's fine to not know everything, and it kind of puts you right in that place, and it feels a lot more real than if the narrator goes, oh, actually this is what they just said, I'll just translate it for you. A lot of the quotes on the back of my copy talk about love quite a lot, and I don't feel like this book is as much about love as people think it is. There are lots of problematic things in this book, especially romanticizing Mr. Rochester, which is sort of totally understandable. And while I think it's really interesting to read about sort of the deep connection connection that Mr. Rochester and Jane have, it's always good to think things over while you're reading it. This is a book that I can see myself reading over and over again in years to come. I love the story. I really enjoyed writing. There's so many different themes being discussed. I actually think that this could be a great starter classic, even though it is quite big. It's not that hard to read. You don't have a bunch of different characters and sort of a non-linear story. I'm looking at you, Wuthering Heights. And I feel like there's lots of things that any teenager or adult could relate to. Those are my thoughts on Jane Eyre. I really enjoyed reading it again, and while I was reading it I was sort of doubting how much I'd actually read of it before. I really wish I could read it for the first time again. So in the comments it would be great if you could avoid posting spoilers, and if you do want to kind of discuss something about the end, maybe put spoilers in all caps and have a couple of open lines and then it will just disappear under the read more bit. Another fun thing that will be going on this week is if you tweet using hashtag Jane Eyre Week, whether it is sharing your favorite quote from the book or sharing a picture of your copy or just talking about Jane Eyre in general, everyone that uses the hashtag is automatically entering themselves in a competition to win a really cool Jane Eyre poster. Just basically the text of I think the first couple of chapters of Jane Eyre with an image of Jane and Mr. Rochester sort of in the middle of that. I think that's it. More Jane Eyre themed videos coming later this week. I hope you enjoyed this review and I'll talk to you guys later. Doei!